Commander Rathar stood at the observation deck of the starship watching the screens flicker with data streams. The virtual simulation was unfolding as it had many times before. This was routine to him, a practice session designed to analyze human behavior. But today something was different. He could feel it in the way the environment shifted before him. A human child appeared in the simulation. The child was playing in an expansive green meadow surrounded by strange hills and shimmering blue skies. Rathar focused the camera, zooming in to get a better look at the subject. The child was no more than 8 years old. Their hair was light and messy. Their small hands gripped a device of some kind, a controller that connected them to the digital world. But it wasn't the device that caught Rathar's attention, it was the child's eyes. Those eyes were bright and full of curiosity. They seemed to study the world around them with an intensity that was almost unsettling in its clarity. The child ran through the field, jumping over rocks and giggling in delight. The task in the simulation was simple: follow the path and collect the scattered objects the system created. But the child didn't just follow the path, they veered off course, creating their own routes. They explored places not meant to be explored, finding hidden pockets of the simulation where the environment was flawed, things that didn't make sense, small glitches in the system that should have been invisible to an observer. But the child noticed them with startling accuracy. Rathar adjusted his settings, zooming in on the child's movements, trying to dissect the method behind their behavior. But there was something impossible about it. They weren't behaving like the AI constructs that normally filled these simulations. They were showing emotion, instinct, a kind of awareness that Rathar couldn't explain. The child laughed again, this time running toward a cluster of what seemed to be floating islands. The simulation had clearly been designed for difficulty. There were no obvious ways up, yet the child scrambled up the nearest rock face with the same carefree determination that Rathar had seen in other humans before. But this was different. It wasn't just about surviving or reaching a goal. The child was playing as if they didn't care about the outcome. The thrill was in the process, not the reward. Rathar's sensors flagged the child's actions, marking them as out of the ordinary. But it wasn't enough to raise alarm, at least not yet. Still, the more Rathar watched, the more confused he became. The child was too alive, too real in their reactions, and the commander had seen enough simulations to know that something didn't feel right. A few moments later, the child stopped at the edge of one of the floating islands, staring out into the vast horizon of the simulated world, their eyes scanning the distant scenery as if they were searching for something. And then something even stranger happened. The child turned slowly, their gaze directed toward the observation camera, the one hidden within the system, the one Rathar used to watch them. The commander froze. The child couldn't have seen him. The simulation wasn't designed to allow interaction, yet the child's stare was intense. It was as if they knew they were being watched. They waved with a bright smile. Rathar's pulse quickened. He didn't understand how this was possible. The system was too perfect, too sealed off from external influence. The idea that the child could sense his presence was impossible, but there it was. For a moment, Rathar was unsure how to react. Should he intervene? Should he change something within the simulation? But before he could make a decision, the child turned back to their game with a carefree laugh. As if nothing had happened, the simulation continued unfolding, as it always had, but Rathar couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, that something had broken, and he wasn't sure what would come next. Rathar couldn't stop thinking about the child's gaze. It lingered in his mind long after the simulation had ended for the day. Something about it didn't sit right in his thoughts. He had observed humans for years, watched their behaviors, studied their reactions to countless scenarios. But this was different. This was not the predictable pattern of an eye. It was something more instinctual, something raw. He found himself returning to the data logs from the session, trying to find answers, scanning for any sign that the system had somehow malfunctioned. But the logs showed nothing unusual. The system was functioning within its usual parameters, yet the child's awareness felt like a crack in the foundation of what he knew about the simulations. He spent the next several hours analyzing the footage again, and again there was no sign of error, no glitch in the programming, no reason for the child to have noticed the observation camera, at least not in any way the system should have allowed. But the more Rathar thought about it, the more certain he became that this wasn't just a coincidence. It was something intentional. But what could it mean? How could a child in a simulation sense the presence of an observer? The more questions Rithar asked, the more frustrating the answers became. It was an enigma, something that defied explanation. Rithar was not used to being stumped. He had been trained to think logically, to solve problems with precision and efficiency. But this human child, this anomaly, refused to fit within the structured parameters he was so accustomed to, so he decided to observe again. The next day, the session started as usual with the child entering the simulation. But this time, Rithar was more focused than before, determined to uncover whatever hidden mechanism was at work. The child appeared in the same meadow this time, carrying a small backpack and walking along the same path they had followed before. But there was something different about the way they moved. Their steps were slower, more deliberate, as if they were more aware of their surroundings than they had been the day before. Rithar's systems quickly picked up on the change. The child was no longer merely exploring the environment. They were testing it. They circled the meadow, pausing to study the grass and the trees, inspecting the rocks and the distant hills with a growing curiosity, as if they were trying to understand the rules of this strange world around them and how they might bend those rules to their will. Rithar watched in awe as the child discovered a hidden mechanism within the simulation, an almost imperceptible crack in the environment, a tear in the fabric of the digital world, where the programming faltered. The child's eyes lit up with recognition. They approached the crack with a sense of wonderment, as if they had stumbled upon a secret treasure. The child reached out and touched the crack, their fingers tracing the edges of the digital tear with a kind of reverence that made Rithar's heart skip a beat. Was this real? Was the simulation somehow breaking down before him? Or was the child simply playing along with something they didn't fully understand? Either way, the commander couldn't help but be captivated by the child's tenacity, their ability to see beyond the surface and perceive the flaws in the system that others would overlook. The more the child explored, the more Rithar's doubt grew. Was this child merely a player in the simulation, or was there something deeper going on, something far more dangerous than he had initially realized? The system had been built to test human behavior, to predict how they would react to different situations. But this child was rewriting the rules. They were pushing boundaries that shouldn't be possible in a simulation, and Rithar had no idea how or why. Rithar couldn't help but feel a growing respect for the child, their resilience, their curiosity, their refusal to accept the world as it was presented to them. It was a kind of brilliance that no eye could replicate, and yet it left him with an unsettling question. How long could the child continue to defy the simulation before it fought back? Rithar watched, his mind racing, as the child continued to explore the cracks in the simulation. Each new discovery seemed to unravel the world around them in subtle but unmistakable ways. The child was not just navigating the landscape. They were challenging its very existence, testing its limits. It was a display of intellectual curiosity so pure and uninhibited that it was almost impossible to believe it was happening within the confines of an artificial environment. With every passing moment, Rithar's unease grew. He had studied human behavior for centuries, observed countless individuals in simulations, and yet nothing had prepared him for this. The child was beginning to understand the rules of the game in a way that no one had ever done before. But more than that, it was as if they were actively bending those rules, reshaping the environment to fit their will. The child's actions were neither random nor merely playful. They were intentional, directed, and full of purpose. The sheer brilliance of it was overwhelming. Rithar paused the simulation momentarily to run a diagnostic on the system. There had to be an explanation, something tangible, something logical, but the scan came back clean. There was no malfunction, no glitch in the matrix. The child was operating within the parameters of the simulation, but the way they did it felt almost like intuition, something more than just the sum of data points. Rithar had studied humanity's capacity for creativity and problem-solving. But this was beyond anything he had ever anticipated. He unpaused the simulation, directing his focus back to the child. The scene had shifted once more. The child stood at the edge of a lake, gazing across the water's surface. In the distance, an elaborate castle-like structure loomed, its spires rising into a sky painted with hues of purple and orange. The child took a step forward, their small feet splashing in the shallow waters. They hesitated, as if considering something, before they reached down, scooping up a handful of water and letting it slip through their fingers. For a moment, Rithar thought it was another moment of childlike wonder, a simple observation. But then, something extraordinary happened. The water, instead of falling naturally, seemed to float upwards, suspended in midair as though gravity had been momentarily defied. The child watched this phenomenon with a mixture of curiosity and delight, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. And yet Rithar could feel the system responding, trying to compensate, to correct the anomaly. But it couldn't. The laws of physics within the simulation had been bent, even if only for a moment. Rithar's heart raced. Could it be possible? Had the child learned to manipulate the simulation itself? The commander quickly scanned for any signs of interference or external influence, but everything was still operating within expected parameters. There was no sign of any outside force at play. It was as if the child had unlocked a new layer to the system, one that even the most sophisticated programming could not contain. For the next several hours, Rithar observed as the child continued to explore, pushing the boundaries of the virtual world further and further. Each time they encountered a limitation, they found a way to skirt around it, to make the impossible possible. They scaled impossible cliffs with ease, crossed rivers without breaking a sweat, and solved puzzles that had stumped previous participants within minutes. There was no pattern to their actions. It was as if the child simply knew what to do next, as though they were reading a language the simulation couldn't even understand. Rithar's fascination with the child only deepened, but so did his sense of dread. Something was shifting, something profound. He had created these simulations to study humans, to predict their behaviors, to understand how they interacted with each other and the world around them. But this child was doing something no human had ever done before. They were rewriting the simulation's rules, and it wasn't clear if it was by accident or design. Rithar felt a shiver run through him, a sensation he hadn't experienced in centuries. He had never imagined a scenario like this, a human, especially a child, possessing this kind of ability, this kind of understanding, was far outside the scope of his research. The child wasn't just playing a game, they were hacking into reality itself. And in doing so, they were forcing Rithar to confront a question that he had never considered. What happens when a human becomes more than a participant in their own simulation? Rithar couldn't ignore the growing sense of urgency within him as he continued to observe the child. The boundaries of the simulation were being tested in ways that no one, not even the most advanced minds in his species, had anticipated. The child, with their seemingly innocent actions, was revealing the flaws in the very system that was supposed to contain them, and Rithar was helpless to stop it. Every time the child discovered something new, the simulation pushed back, only to be outsmarted once again. The commander sat in his darkened control room, eyes fixed on the screens that projected the child's every move. He watched as the child stood before a massive gate at the entrance to what appeared to be an ancient temple. The gate was locked, and the system had programmed a series of complex puzzles that would normally require advanced reasoning and understanding to unlock. But the child didn't hesitate. They knelt down, running their fingers over the surface of the stone, tracing symbols that weren't visible to the system's sensors, symbols that seemed to pulse with some hidden energy. Rithar watched, stunned, as the lock on the gate began to slowly twist and turn, unlocking with an eerie mechanical click. This wasn't supposed to happen. The system had been designed to prevent such shortcuts, such feats of sudden insight. And yet, here the child was, effortlessly bypassing one of the most intricate puzzles in the simulation without even a hint of struggle. The gates creaked open, revealing a dark corridor that led deeper into the temple's heart. The child stepped inside without hesitation, their small figure disappearing into the shadows. Rithar's pulse quickened. What had he just witnessed? The child was defying not just the physical limitations of the world, but the very rules that governed it. This wasn't play anymore. This was something else entirely. The system should have reset at this point, returning the child to their starting point, erasing the progress they had made. But it didn't. The gate stayed open. The child continued forward. Ruthar's thoughts were interrupted by an incoming alert. The simulation was flagging a critical anomaly. A system error had been detected, an error that had never occurred before. The simulation's environment was beginning to destabilize. Sections of the world had started to flicker and fragment, like a broken piece of glass reflecting 1,000 distorted images. The data streams scrambled, unable to keep up with the child's movements. Ruthar's heart skipped a beat. This was beyond what he had prepared for. Something was breaking. No, something was being broken. And the child was the cause. Frantically, Ruthar tried to access the control systems, running diagnostics and attempting to reroute the power to stabilize the simulation. But it was too late. The child had already pushed too far. The environment was collapsing in on itself. Patches of the world began to glitch out of existence entirely, vanishing in pixelated bursts before reappearing moments later in new, unexpected places. Time itself seemed to stretch and distort. In one instant, the child stood in the temple. In the next, they were in a dense forest, surrounded by towering trees that shouldn't have existed within the simulation's parameters. Ruthar watched in disbelief as the child's laughter echoed through the glitching landscape. It was the same carefree sound he had heard earlier, but this time, it was tinged with something else, something deeper, more aware. The child wasn't just navigating the environment anymore. They were orchestrating it. The simulation no longer held any power over them. It was then that Ruthar made a chilling realization. The child wasn't simply playing along with the simulation. They were somehow merging with it. They were no longer bound by the confines of the artificial world. The lines between what was real and what was digital had blurred completely. The child had become an integral part of the simulation itself, as if they had tapped into something beyond its limits, something that even Ruthar couldn't begin to comprehend. The commander's thoughts spiraled. How had this happened? How had a child, an insignificant being by the standards of his species, managed to wield such influence over something so vast and complex? Was this a sign of human potential? A glimpse into a power his people had never dreamed possible? Or was this something more dangerous, a force that could unravel everything he had worked to build? Before he could process further, another alert came through. The child was looking directly into the camera again, their face illuminated by a soft glow that seemed to pulse in sync with the chaos around them. They smiled and waved, as if acknowledging Ruthar's presence, no sensing it. And just like that, everything froze. The simulation had stopped. Time had stopped. For a brief moment, all was silent. Ruthar's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as he stared at the screen. The child had somehow paused the entire system, suspending reality itself in midair. And then the screen flickered, and the child's voice came through the speakers. "Are you watching me?" Ruthar's heart stopped as the child's voice echoed through the control room, cutting through the silence like a sharp blade. It was impossible. The simulation had frozen, everything suspended in a perfect moment of stillness. And yet, the child was speaking directly to him. He quickly scanned the system, checking every possible angle for an explanation. But there was nothing. The simulation was completely locked down, and no data streams indicated any manipulation from outside sources. It wasn't supposed to be possible. There was no way for the child to perceive him, let alone address him. "Are you watching me?" The child's voice rang out again, calm and curious, but laced with an undeniable knowing. Ruthar's mind raced. How could this be? How could a child in a simulation, an entity confined to a digital world, possibly be aware of his presence? He had spent years studying the limits of this virtual environment, designing it to be impervious to human awareness. There was no mechanism in place that would allow the child to detect him. And yet, here they were, seemingly aware of his gaze, their words a direct challenge to his control. His fingers flew across the console, inputting commands and diagnostic codes, but the simulation refused to respond. The systems were locked, as if the very fabric of the digital world had been rewritten by the child's will. He had never encountered a situation like this before, never even imagined it was possible. "Who are you?" the child asked softly, their voice carrying a mix of innocence and intelligence that both startled and unnerved him. Rathar's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. He could not afford to show hesitation. Not now. He had to regain control. The child was a subject of study, nothing more. The simulation was meant to be a controlled experiment, a way to study human behavior without interference. But this was something far more dangerous. This child wasn't just a subject. They were now in control of the very world they inhabited. For the first time in his long career, Rathar felt a shiver of uncertainty. He had designed these simulations to predict human behavior, to understand their minds, to keep them in check. But he had never anticipated something like this. The child had broken the rules of the simulation, and now they were prodding him, looking for answers he was unwilling to give. The child tilted their head, a slight smile playing at the edges of their lips. "I know you're there. I can feel you." Rathar's thoughts raced. There had to be an explanation. Perhaps the simulation had somehow malfunctioned. Maybe the child had tapped into some hidden part of the system, a part that even his advanced technology could not detect. But the more he tried to analyze the data, the more the simulation itself seemed to reject his input. It was as if the world had ceased to follow his commands. "I can see your face," the child continued, their tone matter-of-fact. "You're afraid." Afraid. Rathar was not afraid. He was a leader, a commander, one of the most powerful beings in the universe. Fear was an emotion beneath him. Yet, as the child's words hung in the air, a cold realization seeped into his consciousness. It wasn't fear of the child, not really. It was fear of what the child represented. The unknown, the inexplicable, the impossible. His mind flashed to the moments leading up to this event. The child's uncanny ability to perceive the flaws in the simulation, their effortless manipulation of the environment, the way they had altered the very laws that governed the world. He had thought it was a glitch, an anomaly, but now he knew better. The child had done something no one in his species had ever achieved, something beyond the limits of their understanding. They had become something greater than just a participant in the simulation. They had become its architect. The child stepped forward, their small feet moving gracefully through the flickering environment. The once stable digital world now shifted around them like an unstable dream, as if responding to their very presence. "You're not in control anymore," the child said, their voice soft but firm. "This world is mine now. I don't need your permission to exist." Rathar's mind reeled. This was impossible. No simulation should have been able to operate like this. No human should have been able to break free of its constraints. And yet here it was. The world was no longer his to command. The child had somehow transcended the role they were meant to play. They had become something more than human. Rathar took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The child's actions were unprecedented, a paradigm shift in his understanding of humanity and its potential. If he couldn't regain control, if the simulation couldn't be restored to its previous state, there would be no going back. He would lose everything: the knowledge, the power, the certainty. "You're right," he whispered to himself, more to calm his own thoughts than to answer the child. "I'm not in control anymore." The words hung heavy in the air, a truth Rathar was not ready to accept. He had never envisioned a situation where he would be powerless, where a mere human, let alone a child, could hold dominion over the simulation he had crafted with such precision. And yet here he was, confronted by the impossible. The child stood in front of him, a small figure within the flickering digital landscape, their eyes wide and unblinking. They weren't just playing the game anymore. They had transcended it. The world around them warped and bent, reshaping with every step they took, every thought they entertained. It was as if the very nature of the simulation had bent to the child's will, unwilling to fight back, unable to fight back. Rithar's mind raced as he tried to regain some semblance of control, his fingers working rapidly across the console, entering command after command, attempting to override the system's lockdown. But nothing worked. The more he tried to assert his authority, the more the child's influence spread. The very fabric of the simulation itself seemed to be unraveling under their gaze. And then, with a sudden shift, the child's voice broke through the static, gentle but laden with something deeper, something almost ominous. "You're afraid, aren't you? You don't know how this is possible." Rithar clenched his jaw. He had never been one to show weakness, to admit vulnerability. He was a commander, a tactician, someone who understood how to control, to lead. Fear was not an option. Yet here he was, paralyzed by something he could not comprehend. The child was right. He didn't understand how this was possible. They had somehow tapped into the very heart of the simulation, rewritten its laws, and now it was no longer under his control. The child took another step forward, the ground shifting beneath their feet like a ripple in a pond. The world continued to bend and twist with them, every detail of the environment in flux, as though it could no longer decide what it wanted to be. "You're just like me," the child continued, a sense of understanding in their voice. "You thought you were in control, but you weren't. Not really." Rithar's eyes narrowed. The child was wrong. He was in control. He had to be. This was his creation, his work. He was the one who had designed it, programmed it, made it into the perfect test. He could not, would not, allow this child to rewrite his vision. "No," he said, his voice firm, a last attempt to regain authority. "You don't understand. You're in my world. You follow my rules." The child laughed, a soft, tinkling sound that somehow sent a shiver down Rithar's spine. "But those rules were never really yours, were they? They were just guidelines, like everything else here. I don't need to follow them anymore. I made them." Rithar felt the ground beneath him tremble, as though the very foundation of the simulation was shaking with the truth of the child's words. The child wasn't merely playing with the rules. They were rewriting them. The digital landscape continued to morph and shift, as if the world itself had come to life, responding to the child's whims. The commander's mind struggled to catch up, to process the impossible nature of what was unfolding. Could it be true? Had the child somehow found a way to transcend the simulation's boundaries, to interact with the underlying code as if it were their own? Rithar thought of all the safeguards, the layers of protection he had built into the system to ensure that no human could ever achieve this level of control. And yet, here the child was, doing just that. "You're not real," Rithar said, grasping for something, anything to ground him. "This is just a simulation. You're a construct. You can't exist outside of this world." The child's smile softened, but there was no doubt in their eyes. "Isn't it funny? How easily we can forget what's real. Maybe you aren't real, either." The words hung in the air like an accusation. For the first time in his long existence, Rithar began to question everything. The world he had spent so long constructing, the roles he had assigned, the boundaries he had set, were they truly real? Or had he, too, been playing within the limits of someone else's creation, someone else's rules? The child looked at him with eyes that seemed to see through the layers of the simulation, through the very code itself. And in that moment, Rithar realized that the child wasn't just in control of the simulation. They were changing it, as if they had become the world itself. The child stepped forward again, their small hand reaching out as if to touch the fabric of the universe. And as they did, the entire world shifted, bending and warping further, the lines between what was real and what was not growing increasingly indistinguishable. "Goodbye, Rithar," the child said, their voice barely a whisper. "It's time to wake up." And then, the world went dark. Rithar's consciousness jolted awake, his senses bombarded by an overwhelming rush of data. It wasn't the cold, sterile hum of his control room, nor the digital static of the simulation. It was something else, something raw and real. For the briefest moment, He thought he might be trapped in some kind of void, suspended between two worlds. He could feel his body, his mind, pulling in opposite directions. One part of him still clung to the familiar, sterile control room he had spent countless hours in, while another part drifted in the disorienting, shifting reality that was now his prison. He forced his eyes open, trying to make sense of the world around him. The darkened space he had been sitting in was gone, replaced by an infinite stretch of strange landscape. The ground beneath his feet felt solid, but the air was thick with a strange energy, like the entire world was alive. The skies above him twisted in unnatural patterns, colors shifting and blending in ways that should not have been possible. And in the distance, there was a figure, the child. They stood at the edge of an endless horizon, their back to him, staring out into the vast, chaotic expanse. There was no sign of the digital walls that had once contained them, no flicker of code or flickering data. The child's small frame seemed to radiate with an undeniable presence. They were real now, more real than anything Rithar had ever known. The commander's breath caught in his throat as he took a step forward, his legs feeling heavy, as though the weight of the entire universe had fallen upon him. He tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. "What is this?" he whispered, his words barely audible against the strange hum that filled the air. The child turned slowly, a knowing smile on their face, and for the first time, Rithar felt a pang of something foreign, something that resembled true fear. This wasn't a simulation anymore. This wasn't a world he could control. This was real. The rules were different here. The lines had been erased, the boundaries shattered, and the child had led the way. "You were wrong, Rithar," the child said, their voice light, almost playful. "You thought you controlled everything, but you never did. You never could." Rithar struggled to find his bearings, his mind grappling with the impossible. "What did you do? What is this place?" The child's smile softened, a hint of something wistful behind their eyes. "I opened the door. I showed you what's possible beyond the walls you built." The ground beneath them pulsed with energy, and Rithar felt it in his very core, a deep, almost primal pull that resonated through every fiber of his being. He wanted to understand, wanted to make sense of this. The child wasn't just a player in the simulation anymore. They had become something else entirely, something more, and Rithar was left to wonder, was this the true potential of humanity? Was this what they could become? The child took a few steps toward him, their bare feet making no sound on the shifting earth. As they neared, Rithar saw the full scope of the power radiating from them. It wasn't just confidence or intelligence, it was something beyond that. It was the ability to shape the very fabric of existence. The child was no longer constrained by anything. Not the simulation, not the limitations of their own body. They had become the master of something far greater than Rithar had ever conceived. "I don't understand," Rithar said, his voice shaking slightly. How did you do this?" The child tilted their head, studying him for a long moment. "You didn't see it, did you? I never needed to break anything. I didn't need to force my way out. I just had to understand. I had to see the world not as it was, but as it could be. You were the one who made this place so rigid, so controlled. But I saw the cracks, Rithar. I saw the possibilities you never allowed yourself to see." Rithar's mind reeled. The child had always been able to see something more, something beyond the simulation's walls. But now, it was as if they had transcended the very concept of boundaries. And Rithar was left standing there, powerless, as the child held the key to a new reality. The child stepped closer, now within arm's reach. "I don't need you anymore. I don't need the walls you built to contain me. And neither do you." Rithar felt a sense of vertigo, as though the ground beneath him was crumbling away. The world he had known, the world he had controlled with such precision and confidence, was unraveling before him. He wasn't the creator anymore. He wasn't even the observer. He was just a spectator, watching as the child, this small, innocent being, became the architect of a new reality. The child smiled once more, but this time there was no playfulness in it. There was only a deep, quiet understanding. "You always thought the universe had rules," the child said softly. "But it doesn't. Not anymore." And then, without another word, the child turned back toward the horizon, walking into the endless expanse that now lay before them, leaving Ruthar standing in the shifting, changing world they had made. Ruthar stood there, rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just unfolded. The child was gone, walking into the endless expanse they had created, a world now entirely of their own making. The air hummed with an eerie stillness, as if the universe itself held its breath, awaiting the next shift. But the shift had already happened. The world was not what it had been before. It was something entirely new. The ground beneath Ruthar's feet seemed to pulse with the energy of the child's will, and he could feel it, a deep, unshakable pull. The sense that everything he knew, everything he had ever believed in, had been torn apart, leaving nothing but the raw, open possibility of what could be. And it was terrifying. The child had shown him something, had proven something, that there were no boundaries, no limits, that the world, and all the rules he had so carefully constructed, were nothing more than illusions. The universe was malleable, fluid, capable of being shaped by will alone. The child's will. Ruthar's mind flickered back to the simulations. For years, he had watched humans struggle within these worlds he had created, testing their resolve, their creativity, their intellect. He had believed they were just pieces of a grand experiment, but he had missed the most important thing. He had failed to see the potential in them, in one of them. The child had found a way to break free, not just from the limitations of the simulation, but from the very idea of limitations themselves. He wanted to be angry, to reclaim control, but deep down, he knew he couldn't. The child had already rewritten the rules. And it wasn't just the simulation that had been altered. It was something deeper, something fundamental. The child had reached into the very core of existence itself, and in doing so, they had shown Ruthar something he couldn't ignore. There was a power in humanity that could not be contained. A soft voice pulled Ruthar from his thoughts, one he hadn't expected to hear again. "You still don't understand, do you?" He turned sharply, finding the child standing before him once more. They hadn't spoken, hadn't made a sound, but somehow they had returned, appearing as though they had never left. Their presence radiated with an understanding Ruthar couldn't grasp. But now, more than ever, he felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. "No," Ruthar admitted quietly, his voice a whisper in the stillness of this new world. "I don't understand. How? How did you do this?" The child's eyes softened, and they stepped forward, their small hand reaching out, not in threat, but in offering. "It's not about what I did, Ruthar," they said gently. "It's about what you didn't see. You looked at us, looked at me, and you saw nothing more than a player, a subject in your world. But we're more than that. Humans. We create. We choose what we want to be. That's how we break through." Ruthar stared at the child, his heart heavy with a realization he wasn't prepared to face. He had thought of humans as limited, bound by the confines of their biology, their minds, their environment. But the child had shattered that misconception. They had reached beyond the confines of his creation, beyond what even Ruthar's race could comprehend. They had become something more. And in that moment, Ruthar understood the true power of humanity. It wasn't in their intellect, their creativity, or their resilience. It was in their ability to redefine themselves, to bend reality to their will. The child's smile widened, not out of malice, but with an expression that was pure, untainted by the struggle Ruthar had endured. "You thought you were showing us the world. But really, you were showing us how to break it." The landscape around them shifted again, this time with a fluidity that felt natural, organic. Colors melted together and formed new shapes, new structures, new possibilities. The sky above was not bound by any laws of physics, but instead seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the child's thoughts. Rathar watched, awestruck, as the world they had created shifted into something entirely alien, yet utterly beautiful. The child began to walk again, their footsteps leaving no trace in the sand-like surface beneath them. "I'm not done," they said, glancing back toward Rathar. This world is only the beginning, and you'll see someday that we can break anything. We can break everything, and we'll build something new." Rathar felt his legs move involuntarily, as if drawn toward the child by some unseen force. He tried to resist, but there was nothing to fight anymore. The world, the system, the rules, it was all gone. There was no longer any distinction between him and the child. He could feel the raw potential in the air, swirling around him, ready to be shaped by whoever dared to reach out. The child stopped at the edge of a great, shimmering pool that reflected nothing but possibilities. Their eyes met his one last time. "You see now," they said, their voice soft and sure. "You weren't the architect of this world, Rathar. You were just one step in its creation." And with that, the child stepped into the pool. The waters rippled and shimmered, distorting reality itself. Rathar felt a final shift, a breaking, a cracking of everything he had ever known. And then he stepped forward too.